My husband demanded that I sign over the $200,000 condo, the one my parents had given me before the wedding, to his younger brother. When I refused, he filed for divorce on the spot. 3 months later, he came crawling back. The moment the door swung open, he went completely pale. That condo, worth about $200,000, was the only thing my parents ever gave me, and my husband wanted me to hand it over to his younger brother as a wedding gift. When I stood my ground, he immediately demanded a divorce, utterly convinced he'd walk away with half of everything. But he had no idea that the day I signed those papers was the day his reckoning began. He had no clue what kind of regret would hit him 3 months later, when he showed up begging to reconcile and saw whose arm was draped around my shoulder. The dinner that night was so quiet I could hear the silverware clinking against the plates. Unlike most evenings, Derek wasn't glued to his phone or complaining that the food was too salty or too bland. He sat up straight, his expression unusually serious. He placed a piece of pan-seared salmon on my plate, then cleared his throat. That sudden show of courtesy sent a cold wave of dread washing through me. In 3 years of marriage, every time Derek acted considerate, it always came packaged with a request, usually about money or something his family needed. Derek set his fork down and looked me dead in the eye, his voice carrying that tone of a man accustomed to giving orders. He told me his younger brother, Tyler, was getting married next month. Tyler's fiance's family had made it clear no house, no wedding. He went on and on about how their parents back in Ohio were getting old and frail, couldn't manage the burden anymore, and how he, as the eldest son, had a responsibility to step up and carry the family. Then he dropped the hammer. He told me to sign the condo over to Tyler, our condo, the one we were living in. He called it a wedding gift from Big Brother and his wife. Just like that. I sat there frozen, my heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. That condo sat in one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the city, a 2-bedroom unit, in a luxury high-rise worth about $200,000. It was a gift from my parents, bought with every penny they had scraped together over decades of hard work. They gave it to me before I walked down the aisle. My parents loved me. They knew I'd ignored their warnings and married a man with nothing to his name. They were terrified I'd suffer, so they pooled their savings, bought me the condo, and tucked a separate savings account in my name, just in case. A safety net for their stubborn daughter. And now, here was Derek, tossing out that demand like he was asking me to pass the salt, like he was asking for an old jacket he could borrow and never return. I swallowed the bitter knot lodged in my throat and answered him calmly. I told him plainly, this condo is my separate property. It was my parents' life savings. I said I'd be willing to help Tyler and his fiancée with a small amount of cash, maybe toward a rental deposit or some furniture, but signing over the deed was absolutely out of the question. That was never going to happen. My refusal was a match dropped into a barrel of gunpowder. Derek slammed his fist on the table so hard a dinner plate shattered. He shot to his feet and jabbed his finger straight at my face. He called me a selfish, petty woman who thought she was better than his family just because she had a little money. He shouted that if I couldn't respect his family, if I couldn't be reasonable, then we should just get divorced. Then he puffed out his chest and declared that once they got to court, everything, the condo, the savings, all of it would be split straight down the middle. He said I'd regret the day I dared to defy him. I looked at the man standing in front of me, face flushed crimson, veins bulging in his neck, and felt every last shred of love and patience I'd been clinging to shatter like that broken plate. For 3 years, I'd shrunk myself down. I dressed plainly, spent nothing, bit my tongue at every turn, all to keep the peace. But human greed is a bottomless pit. I stood up slowly. I walked to the bedroom, opened a small safe in the closet, and pulled out a thick folder wrapped in protective plastic. I carried it back to the dining table and slammed it down in front of Derek. Inside was a prenuptial property agreement, notarized and legally binding, along with every document proving that the funds used to purchase the condo and the savings account had existed entirely before our marriage. Bank statements, wire transfers, closing documents, all of it time-stamped well before our wedding date. I stared straight into his wide, disbelieving eyes and spoke through clenched teeth. I told him the law is very clear. Separate property acquired before marriage remains separate property. If we divorce, He would walk out that door with nothing but the clothes on his back, the same way he came into my life. The color drained from Derek's face. He went from red to white in seconds. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, his fingers clutching the edge of the table. The fragile facade of the domineering husband had been ripped away without mercy. In a fit of rage and humiliation, he lunged across the table, grabbed a pen, and scrawled a wild, angry signature on the divorce petition I'd quietly drafted months ago during our previous arguments but had never used. He hurled the document at me and jerked his chin up in defiance, fully expecting me to panic and beg him to stay. But he was wrong. I picked up the petition, folded it neatly, and then pointed straight at the front door. I told him to get out of my house immediately. He wasn't to take a single thing with him except the cheap clothes on his back. Derek glared at me, but faced with my expression cold as a glacier, he had no fight left. He spun on his heel, slammed the door so hard the walls shook, and left nothing but the echo ringing through the silent apartment. The next morning, the sun had barely crested the skyline when I woke up feeling like an entirely different person. No heaviness, no anxious calculations about what to cook to please his family, no bracing myself for the next unreasonable demand. I pulled out 3 large moving boxes and began packing up every single thing that belonged to Derek. Clothes, shoes, toiletries, right down to the smallest personal item. Looking at the expensive things I'd scrimped and saved to buy for him over the years, I couldn't help but ache for the naive, blind version of myself who'd wasted her youth on this man. I sealed each box with packing tape, called a shipping service, and had everything sent straight to his parents' house in Ohio. A clean break. Every trace of him gone from my space. 3 days later, we met in front of the county courthouse. Derek pulled up on the motorcycle I'd bought him for our first anniversary, a sleek sport bike that hadn't been cheap. When he spotted me, he kept that arrogant posture, chin tilted up, trying to look like he couldn't care less. He tossed the key at me and sneered. "Figures," he said. "You're the kind of woman who'd nickel and dime a man over a motorcycle." I calmly tucked the key into my handbag. Then I reached into my folder and pulled out a certified bank statement, stamped with a red seal. I held it up at his eye level and pointed to the highlighted transaction lines. Over the past 2 years, Derek had been siphoning money out of our joint checking account under the pretense of business expenses and networking. That money didn't go to any business. It went straight into the personal account of his mother, Linda. The total had reached about $20,000. I looked directly into his bulging, panicked eyes and laid it out for him. I told him that secretly draining marital assets during a marriage is illegal. I'd already retained an attorney who had compiled every piece of evidence. If his family didn't return every cent within 30 days, I would file a formal lawsuit. This wasn't a threat, it was a declaration. I intended to recover every dollar that was rightfully mine. Derek stood there like a man who'd been turned to stone. His lips moved, but nothing came out. He had never imagined that the quiet, obedient wife who endured everything in silence had been preparing a counterattack. This precise, this devastating. Leaving him drowning in his own shock, I turned on my heel and walked straight into the courthouse to file the paperwork. When I stepped back out through the courthouse doors, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. A light breeze caught a few loose strands of my hair. I inhaled deeply and felt the air of freedom fill my lungs completely. The suffocating days were officially over. I pulled out my phone and called a rideshare home. It was time to rebuild my life and reclaim every piece of myself I'd surrendered for a love that had never been worth it. A few days later, once I'd settled my personal affairs, I drove out to my parents' house. Mom and Dad didn't say much. Mom just pulled me into her arms and held me. Dad quietly brewed a pot of chamomile tea, the kind he always made when things were hard. Family had always been my safe harbor, the place that forgave my mistakes and tolerated the recklessness of my youth. That evening, I sat down with my father in the living room for a serious conversation. My father was the CEO of a well-established import-export company. Years ago, afraid that Derek would feel inferior, I'd turned down a position at the family business and taken an unremarkable office job elsewhere. But things were different now. I told my father I wanted to come back and help him run the company. Dad smiled, clearly pleased. He offered me a spot on the executive team, a director-level position to make management easier. But I turned it down flat. I didn't want the privilege of being the boss's daughter. I asked him to start me as a project team lead. I wanted to earn my way up on merit. I wanted to learn from the veterans. And most importantly, I wanted every employee in that company to respect me because I'd earned it, not because of my last name. Dad thought it over for a moment, then nodded. I caught the pride shining in his eyes. My first day at the office, I chose a sharp, tailored blazer and matching slacks that fit perfectly. Light makeup, hair pulled into a clean high bun, a complete departure from the frumpy housewife I'd become. When I walked into the large conference room, I greeted everyone with a confident but humble demeanor. Nobody knew I was the CEO's daughter. To them, I was simply a newly hired team lead, assigned to oversee the company's southern market expansion initiative. That morning's meeting included a strategic partner, and that's when I met Andrew. Andrew was the managing director of a major investment fund, the one holding the capital that would determine whether our warehouse expansion project moved forward. He walked in with a polished, composed exterior, but his eyes were razor sharp. When it was my team's turn to present, I stepped up to the front of the room and laid out the business plan with precision, clean data, clear projections, thorough analysis of strengths and vulnerabilities. Andrew fired one pointed question after another, targeting every potential risk in the proposal. Instead of stumbling, I stayed composed. I countered each challenge with real market evidence and defended my conclusions with conviction. I noticed a spark of surprise and approval flash through his eyes. After the meeting, Andrew walked over and shook my hand. He complimented the realism of the plan and my professional poise. In that moment, I knew I'd found my way back to the best version of myself. The condo, my $200,000 separate property, still belonged to me, but every corner, every piece of furniture carried the weight of 3 years of miserable coexistence. Those heavy memories were like cracks in the walls. No matter how hard I tried to ignore them, they suffocated me. I contacted a real estate agent and listed the condo for sale, accepting a price slightly below market to ensure a quick closing. I planned to roll the proceeds into a new company project. Within days, the agent called back. A buyer wanted to pay cash and meet in person to finalize the deal. When the door of the coffee shop opened and I saw who was walking toward my table, I froze. It was Andrew. He pulled out the chair across from me, sat down, and smiled. He explained that he'd heard about the listing through a friend in real estate. His fund frequently brought in foreign consultants who needed premium housing in that exact neighborhood whenever they flew in for extended projects. The location and layout were perfect. Then he looked at me with genuine sincerity and said something that caught me off guard. He said he understood that after major personal upheaval, a woman sometimes needed to change her living environment to truly move forward. Buying the condo served his business needs, and it also helped a promising business partner resolve a personal matter quickly and cleanly. The legal paperwork was completed swiftly. Andrew wired the full amount that same day. When I mentioned I'd need about 5 days to pack up and move back to my parents' place, Andrew waved his hand. He said the consultants wouldn't arrive for another 3 months. He told me to stay in the condo as long as I needed a courtesy extended to the former owner until I found a new place I was happy with or had everything sorted out. His kindness and clear-cut boundaries made me feel a warmth and a deep respect for this man. That very evening, as I was reorganizing the bookshelf, my phone rang. The screen displayed, "Linda, my former mother-in-law." The moment I answered, a torrent of vicious screaming poured through the speaker. She called me heartless, ungrateful, accused me of throwing her son out on the street without a dime. She threatened to show up at my office, at my parents' house, to make a scene and drag my name through the mud for the whole world to see unless I withdrew the lawsuit demanding back that $20,000. I calmly activated the call recording function. I let her scream herself hoarse. Then, in a measured voice, I spoke. I addressed her politely but with unmistakable distance. I reminded her that $20,000 was my hard-earned money. Her son had stolen it to prop up his pathetic charade of being a dutiful son. I warned her, if she dared set foot at my parents' home or my workplace to cause trouble, that recording would go straight to the police, along with charges for harassment, defamation, and disturbing the peace. I hung up, blocked her number. The meek version of me had died alongside that marriage. Life gradually fell into a stable rhythm. Between contracts, market research trips, and the daily grind of building something real, I no longer had time to dwell on the wreckage of the past. One weekend afternoon, Andrew invited me to dinner at a quiet restaurant to discuss the fund's disbursement timeline for our company's project. Midway through the conversation, he casually mentioned a name that made my ears perk up. He told me that a subsidiary of his firm had recently conducted interviews for a warehouse supervisor position. Among the applicants was a young man named Tyler, whose background and family details matched Derek's younger brother exactly. Andrew recounted the interview with a wry, half-amused smile. Tyler had shown up looking sharp on the outside, but when the panel presented crisis management scenarios, he'd exposed a staggering lack of knowledge and a deeply lazy attitude. He kept bragging about having an older brother who was some kind of big shop manager with powerful connections, who was about to hand him a $200,000 condo downtown so he could get married. That kind of hollow, boastful talk didn't fool anyone on the hiring committee. Tyler was rejected in the first round. Reason cited, attitude incompatible with company culture. Hearing Andrew tell the story, I simply took a small sip of wine and felt a quiet wave of relief wash over me. Karma tends to arrive sooner than people expect. I didn't gloat. I just calmly shared a few details about my past with Andrew and remarked that people who build their lives on other people's assets, who refuse to do honest work, will inevitably face failure. But the fallout didn't stop there. A few days later, through mutual friends who still kept in touch with Derek's circle, I learned something that sent shockwaves through their family. Tyler's fiance's family, once they discovered there was no $200,000 condo, that the whole thing had been a lie, and that Tyler was unemployed, broke off the engagement immediately. Her parents declared publicly that they would never marry their daughter off to a con artist who'd fabricated wealth as bait. Derek's family back in Ohio was humiliated beyond measure. The wedding had been cancelled days before the ceremony. Invitations had already been sent. Someone had to go door to door to every relative and family friend to take them back and apologize. Their old house became a war zone of blame. Tyler blamed Derek for being useless. What kind of older brother can't even take care of his own family? Derek blamed his parents for pressuring him, and Linda collapsed from the stress, bedridden with grief and fury. When I heard all this, my heart was as still as a lake without a single ripple. I realized that living with integrity and cherishing your own worth is the only foundation that holds. People who build castles on sand using lies and greed to patch together a facade of success will inevitably watch those castles crumble to dust. I smiled, turned my gaze toward the restaurant window, and watched the river of headlights and taillights flowing through the city at night. Tomorrow would be another new day, a day I'd live fully and completely for myself. The inspection trip to the manufacturing plant down in Georgia was scheduled for a Wednesday morning. The southern heat that time of year was brutal, the kind of thick, swampy humidity that hits you like a wall the second you step outside. Sunlight blazed through the car windows and made the air inside feel like an oven, even with the AC cranked. Riding with me were two people. Mr. Warren, a senior operations director who'd been with the company since the earliest days when my father first started the business, and Kyle, my young assistant, sharp, resourceful, and quick on his feet. Mr. Warren flipped through a thick stack of files on his lap, occasionally pushing his reading glasses up the bridge of his nose, his deep, steady voice filling the car as he analyzed the partner facility's production output figures. This plant was a critical link in our supply chain. Recently, our quality assurance department had been flagging a troubling pattern, shipments arriving with noticeable drops in quality defect rates climbing well above acceptable thresholds. But on paper, the monthly reports sent to our office painted a picture so flawless it was suspicious. It was precisely that suspicious perfection that had driven me to go see the operation with my own eyes. I told Mr. Warren we couldn't keep sitting in air-conditioned offices reading numbers that had been massaged into shape. The market out there has no patience for blind trust without verification. When the car turned into the sprawling industrial park, the roar of heavy machinery and the blare of semi-truck horns flooded in through the windows. The plant manager, a man named Rick Thornton, greeted us at the front gate with a smile so wide and eager it bordered on performative, middle-aged, stocky, with a firm handshake that lingered a beat too long, the kind of guy who wanted you to feel welcome before you had time to think. He led our group on a tour through the production floors, delivering a polished monologue about state-of-the-art equipment, cutting-edge processes, and exceptional employee benefits. But behind that glossy veneer, my trained eye caught things that didn't add up. I deliberately slowed my pace, letting myself drift slightly behind the group so I could observe more carefully. In the textile processing area, I noticed the workers' eyes hollow, glazed over with the kind of exhaustion that goes bone deep. Their hands moved with practiced speed, but their faces were drawn and blank, completely at odds with the reports claiming strict compliance with labor regulations and no unauthorized overtime. Kyle, reading the room, quietly drifted toward the raw materials staging area. He picked up a sample spool of thread, examined it carefully, and discreetly passed it to me. I barely had to tug the thread to know the tensile strength, the color saturation. It was leagues below the premium imported materials our company had been bankrolling this facility to use. I signaled Kyle to stay quiet and shot a look at Mr. Warren, who smoothly engaged Rick Thornton in conversation to keep him distracted. While Thornton was waxing poetic about his ambitious expansion plans, I slipped toward the back wall where a shift schedule board hung half-hidden behind a support column. The handwritten entries, scrawled in hasty penmanship, revealed that this plant had been secretly running an unregistered night shift, using cheap temporary laborers and counterfeit materials to produce knockoff goods, all while continuing to collect our company's premium supply subsidies. The books had been cooked with surgical precision. Throughout the entire visit, I maintained a pleasant, gracious demeanor. I complimented the management team's efforts and smiled at all the right moments. I knew this wasn't the time to kick the hornet's nest. Mr. Warren played his part flawlessly, too, nodding along, making approving sounds at every hollow promise Thornton offered. On the drive back to the city, the atmosphere inside the car turned tense. Kyle, barely containing his anger, laid out every suspicious detail he'd managed to photograph on his phone. Mr. Warren exhaled heavily and confirmed what we all knew: the labor exploitation, the falsified records, the materials fraud. This wasn't just a contract violation. This was criminal. Theft by deception. I stared out the window at the endless stream of traffic, my hand tightening into a fist against my thigh. I told them both, my voice firm and unwavering, that we needed to build an airtight case. Every piece of evidence, documented and verified. We would drag the entire truth into the light and protect this company's reputation at all costs. That evening, dinner at my parents' house was warm and unhurried. Mom and Dad asked about my trip to Georgia, filling my plate while I answered their questions. I planned to brief my father on the plant's fraud after the meal. Mr. Warren had stopped by as well, dropping off some additional files related to the case, and stayed for a cup of tea with the family. Everything was peaceful until it wasn't. A shrill, unhinged scream ripped through the quiet neighborhood like a siren. I frowned, instantly recognizing the voice howling outside our gate. Dad set his teacup down hard, his face tightening, and stepped outside. There, in the middle of the street under the harsh glow of the streetlights, stood Linda, hair wild and disheveled, both fists pounding against our wrought iron gate. Neighbors were already peeking through blinds and stepping onto porches to see what the commotion was about. She was wailing theatrically, sobbing and screaming accusations for the whole block to hear. She shrieked that our family used our money and power to destroy her son's life, to tear her family apart. She called me an ungrateful, heartless daughter-in-law who divorced her son and then tried to bleed his family dry by demanding back every last penny. She howled that I was trying to drive them into their graves. My mother, standing just inside the gate, was trembling with fury. She started to unlock the gate, ready to confront Linda face to face and set the record straight. I caught her arm and gently held her back. I told her to stay inside, that I would handle this myself. I opened the side gate and stepped out calmly to face the woman who was now throwing herself onto the pavement in a full-blown performance, the kind of public meltdown designed to shame and manipulate. The moment she saw me, Linda cranked up the volume, lunging toward me with her hands outstretched like claws. I stepped back, and when I spoke, my voice was ice. I told her to have some dignity. Then I raised my voice just enough so that Linda and every neighbor standing on their porch could hear me clearly. I stated the facts. Derek and I were legally divorced. The money his son had secretly siphoned from our joint account and funneled to her was marital property, and taking it was a crime, plain and simple. Linda flinched at the mention of the money but doubled down, screeching that it was her son's hard-earned cash and I had no right to ask for it back. Without a moment's hesitation, I pulled out my phone and hit play on the recording from her threatening phone call, the one where she had hurled every slur and threat imaginable at me. Her own guttural, vicious words echoed through the quiet street for everyone to hear. The neighbors' expressions shifted. Curiosity gave way to disgust. They started murmuring to each other, shaking their heads, casting looks of contempt at the woman sitting in a heap on the asphalt. Mr. Warren stepped out from the house, his presence commanding, and measured the kind of gravitas that comes from decades in boardrooms and, before that, years in the military. Linda looked up at him with visible apprehension. Mr. Warren spoke in a low, resonant voice that carried the weight of absolute authority. He informed Linda that showing up at someone's private residence to scream, defame, and harass was a criminal offense. He made it crystal clear. If she didn't leave immediately, he would call the police himself and have her charged with trespassing, harassment, and defamation. As he spoke, he pulled out his phone and began dialing. The word police, combined with my unflinching stare and the judgmental eyes of every neighbor on the block, broke whatever act Linda had been putting on. She scrambled to her feet, frantically brushing dirt and gravel off her clothes, her eyes darting around in barely concealed panic. She didn't dare say another word. She turned and scurried down the street, disappearing into the darkness at the end of the block. I let out a slow breath, turned to apologize to the neighbors for the disturbance, and locked the gate. My parents looked at me with a mixture of heartache and admiration. I gave them a reassuring smile. Being soft in the face of cruelty only invites more pain. Meeting it head-on with composure and truth, that's the only real way to protect yourself. Just a few days after Linda's spectacle, another uninvited guest showed up, this time at the company's front door. I just finished the morning briefing and was heading back to my office when the receptionist called up. She said there was a young man in the lobby named Tyler, insisting he needed to see me. He claimed to be the deputy director's brother-in-law and was acting frantic and disheveled. I allowed myself a small, dry smile. I told her to show him to the first-floor meeting room. I'd be right down. When I walked in, Tyler was hunched on the edge of a leather sofa, looking nothing like the swaggering, boastful kid I'd heard about. He wore a wrinkled, button-down shirt, his face gaunt, dark circles carved deep under his eyes. The moment he saw me, he shot to his feet like a drowning man spotting a life raft. He rushed toward me, hands clasped together in front of his chest. He begged. He invoked the years we'd been family, sister-in-law and brother-in-law, and pleaded with me to withdraw the lawsuit over the $20,000. He said his family was on the edge. He was begging me to show mercy and give them a way out. I chose a chair across from him and sat down with my back straight, studying the groveling figure before me with an expression that revealed nothing. I asked him what had brought him so low. Wasn't his family always bragging that his big brother was brilliant, capable, more than able to provide everyone with a comfortable life? At the mention of Derek, Tyler broke down sobbing. Between heaving breaths and stammered words, he revealed something that gave me pause. Derek hadn't just been fired from his old company. He was being prosecuted. Tyler spilled it all in a terrified rush for the past 2 years. Derek had been exploiting his position as a project manager to skim company materials and sell them on the side. He'd forged invoices and purchase orders to embezzle hundreds of thousands of dollars from the company treasury. The fraud had just been uncovered. Derek's former employer had filed a police report and was pressing charges for embezzlement and corporate theft. Derek was now facing serious prison time and an order to repay everything he'd stolen. Their parents back in Ohio had collapsed when they heard the news, their father barely able to get out of bed, their mother's health deteriorating rapidly. The family had no money left, not even enough for groceries, let alone the $20,000 they owed me. Tyler wept that his fiancée's family had already called off the engagement. His family, he said, had truly hit rock bottom. I listened to every word of their pathetic saga, and my heart didn't stir. Every one of their failures traced back to the same roots: bottomless greed, a lifestyle built on appearances, and the delusion that you could fake your way to the top without ever doing honest work. I looked Tyler dead in the eye. My voice carried no trace of pity. I told him the law is fair. Whoever breaks it pays the price. Derek was a grown man. He had to answer for his own greed and deception. Nobody could carry that burden for him. As for the $20,000, it was my legal property. Pursuing its return through the courts was entirely within my rights, and I had no intention of backing down. I told Tyler to go home and advise his brother to cooperate fully with the investigation and accept whatever sentence the court handed down. And I told Tyler himself to find honest work, real labor, to support himself, instead of going around begging for sympathy from people he'd helped wrong. I stood up and called security to escort him out. Leaving his pathetic sobbing behind me, I walked steadily toward the elevator and went back to work. The situation at the Georgia manufacturing plant had reached the point where it demanded decisive action, but it seemed Rick Thornton had already sensed something was off. Our inspection team's subtle shift in demeanor during the visit hadn't gone unnoticed. A guilty man startles at shadows and often strikes first. Midweek, both Human Resources and the Board of Directors received an anonymous letter printed on a standard laser printer and mailed with no return address. The letter accused me, the newly appointed project team lead, of colluding with rival suppliers, accepting illegal kickbacks, and deliberately sabotaging the relationship with the Georgia plant to redirect contracts elsewhere. Attached were blurry, crudely doctored photographs showing me sitting in a coffee shop with a stranger who was, in reality, nothing more than the real estate agent who'd helped me sell my old condo. The language in the letter was cunning and calculated, deliberately exploiting the fact that I was new to the company to sow doubt among the staff. That morning, the atmosphere in the office turned heavy. I caught a few sidelong glances from colleagues, the kind edged with suspicion and uncertainty. My father immediately called a closed-door meeting in his office. Present were me, Mr. Warren, and Andrew, who was there representing the investment fund that had capital deployed in our company. After reading the anonymous letter, my father showed no anger. He didn't question me for a single second. He set the paper down on his desk, smiled calmly, and said he had absolute trust in his daughter's character and integrity. Whoever sent this letter, he said, was clearly terrified and desperate, resorting to cheap tricks to muddy the waters. I laid out my analysis. If we launched an open investigation into Thornton now, he'd have more than enough time to destroy documents, shred evidence, falsify records, and cover every trace of the illegal dumping. Instead, I proposed a different strategy: turn the enemy's own weapon against him. I suggested the company pretend to believe the anonymous letter, issue a formal suspension of my duties, framed as a show of transparency and good governance. Once Thornton believed the threats had been neutralized, that I'd been removed from the game, he and his people would let their guard down and continue operating as usual. That would be our window, the golden moment to catch them red-handed. Andrew sat in silence throughout, listening intently. I saw the light of admiration flicker in his eyes, approval for a plan that was risky but razor-sharp. He volunteered to play a role in the performance, adding another layer of credibility. That afternoon, a company-wide meeting was called. My father stood at the podium, face stern, and announced that due to the anonymous complaint, I was being placed on temporary administrative leave, pending an internal review. Immediately, Andrew rose from his seat in the guest section, his expression shifting to one of visible displeasure. With the theatrical skill of a seasoned executive, he declared in a sharp tone that his fund demanded absolute transparency. If any personnel involved in the project were implicated in corruption, he would seriously consider pulling his investment entirely. The room went dead silent. The severity of the fund director's reaction guaranteed that Thornton's informants inside the company would rush to report every detail of this perfectly staged scene back to their boss. I ducked my head, gathered my papers, and walked out of the conference room looking every bit the humiliated, wrongfully accused employee. The curtain had risen, the invisible net had been cast. All that remained was to wait for the sharks to swim in. 3 days after my suspension took effect, the intelligence network Kyle had quietly built delivered a critical update. Blinded by our flawless performance, Rick Thornton had concluded the thorn in his side was gone. Tonight, the Georgia plant would receive a massive shipment of counterfeit raw materials. And tonight, they planned to dump a huge volume of untreated industrial wastewater into the river behind the industrial park to save the cost of running the filtration system. This was our once-in-a-lifetime chance. At exactly 11 o'clock that night, Andrew's black SUV slipped silently out of the city, heading south toward Georgia. Inside the vehicle, me, Andrew, and Kyle. We wore dark clothing and carried low-light cameras, compact flashlights, and everything we'd need. Silence hung thick in the cabin. My heartbeat hammered in my ears. Andrew was behind the wheel. Every so often he'd glance over at me, and the steadiness in his eyes transmitted a calm I desperately needed. He whispered that I should relax. He'd already coordinated with a unit from the State Economic Crimes Unit, positioned 5 miles from the plant. The moment we sent the signal, they'd move in. We parked on a patch of empty land, concealed behind a dense line of pine trees near the industrial park's perimeter. From there, we moved on foot along a narrow, overgrown trail toward a section of chain-link fence that had already been cut open, a gap identified by our inside source. The night air around the industrial park was thick with the acrid stench of chemical smoke and the nauseating reek of open drainage. The sky was a wall of black, not a single star visible. We pressed ourselves into the shadows, inching toward the main production building. Inside, machinery still growled and churned. Through a ventilation grate, we had a clear view of the operation. Dozens of workers were frantically peeling labels off crates of cheap, off-brand materials and replacing them with the premium brand labels of our company's authorized suppliers. In another corner, a massive pipe was gushing jet-black wastewater, foaming white at the edges, straight into the shared drainage canal. Carl found the clearest angles and fired off shot after shot, documenting every violation in high resolution. Every piece of evidence, data, and visual was now in our hands. The job was done, clean and fast. I signaled the other two that it was time to pull back the way we'd come. Then disaster struck. As I turned to move, the strap of my bag snagged on a piece of rebar jutting from a decrepit scaffold. The jolt sent a metal pipe balanced on the framework, clattering down onto the concrete floor. The sound cracked through the night like a gunshot. Instantly, alarm lights began flashing. Guard dogs erupted into a frenzy of barking from the main gate. High-powered flashlight beams swept across the yard in wide, hunting arcs. From inside the building, boots pounded against concrete, and men barked orders at each other, fanning out to find the intruders. We'd been detected. My heart leapt into my throat. Panic began closing in from every direction. Andrew grabbed my hand. His grip was iron, powerful and absolute. He pulled me to my feet, his voice low but carrying the force of a battlefield command. He told Kyle and me to stay low and follow him fast toward the row of abandoned storage buildings along the western wall. The chase through the darkness had begun. The shadows between the derelict buildings were so thick they felt solid. Every few seconds, a flashlight beam slashed through the black, sweeping dangerously close. The guard dogs were getting louder, closer. Boots thundered. Men shouted profanities and coordinated their search patterns. Andrew's hand never let go of mine. His warmth, his certainty, anchored me even as terror threatened to take over. Kyle stayed glued to our heels, his breathing ragged with adrenaline. We ran hunched over, dodging past shattered windows and crumbling door frames. When we reached the end of the last abandoned warehouse, we hit a dead end, a towering concrete wall crowned with razor wire. Behind us, the flashlight beams were already probing the scrapyard less than 50 yards away. Then Andrew spotted it, a large, corrugated metal ventilation duct, hidden behind a cluster of rusted oil drums. The duct ran from inside the building, through the wall, and out to a dry drainage ditch on the other side of the perimeter. Without a second's hesitation, Andrew shoved the empty drums aside, clearing a gap just wide enough. He sent Carl through first, then gripped my shoulders and carefully guided me into the narrow opening. He went last, dragging a loose sheet of corrugated metal across the entrance behind him. Inside the duct, the darkness was absolute. The stench of rust and years of accumulated grime hit my nostrils so hard I nearly gagged. I clamped my hand over my mouth to smother every sound. The space was so tight we had to army crawl, inch by agonizing inch. At one pinch point where the duct narrowed even further, I could barely move at all. Claustrophobia and raw fear surged up my throat like bile. Andrew sensed my panic instantly. In that pitch-black, suffocating tunnel, he crawled close, so close I could hear every beat of his heart and feel the warmth of his breath against my cheek. He slid his arm around my waist and used his own strength to help me inch forward. His voice came soft and steady against my ear, telling me to breathe deep, stay calm, that we were almost out. His protection in that moment, so instinctive, so unshakable, was like a sedative for every fear screaming inside me. My focus returned. I kept crawling toward the faint sliver of light at the end of the duct. After 15 minutes that felt like a century, all three of us tumbled out the far end into a patch of tall grass beside the dry ditch, well beyond the plant's perimeter wall. Our clothes were caked in mud. Our hands and arms were scratched raw from scraping against the jagged metal, but none of us cared about the pain. We lay flat in the grass, gasping for air. Andrew immediately pulled his phone from his chest pocket and fired off a pre-written message. Less than 5 minutes later, from both ends of the road leading into the industrial park, sirens erupted, piercing, relentless, tearing the silent night wide open. A convoy of vehicles from the State Economic Crimes Unit and the Environmental Protection Agency roared through the front gate, blue and red lights strobing. The guards who'd been hunting us moments ago dropped their flashlights and scattered in panic, only to be tackled and restrained within seconds. From our hidden vantage point, we watched the entire scene unfold through gaps in the wall. Officers swarmed every building, sealing off the counterfeit materials and the machinery used to relabel them. The illegal discharge pipe was photographed, sampled, and documented on the spot. Rick Thornton was led out in handcuffs, his face drained of all color, ashen, bloodless. The smug confidence and that slick smile he wore every day had vanished completely, replaced by raw terror and the hollow stare of a man who knew it was over. The net had been pulled in, a resounding, total success. Every photograph, every document Kyle carried in that camera would be the final nails in the coffin for every last one of them. Andrew turned to me and smiled, warm, genuine, exhausted. He reached over and gently wiped a streak of mud from my forehead. "Justice," he said quietly. Finally. The next morning, our company headquarters buzzed with an energy I'd never felt before. News of the Georgia plant manager's midnight arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and criminal environmental violations had spread through every department like wildfire. Shock and disbelief were written across every face. At 9 o'clock sharp, an emergency meeting was called in the main conference hall. My father took the podium, his bearing commanding, his voice filling every corner of the room. He officially reinstated me, publicly and unequivocally dismissed the anonymous letter as a fabrication, and ordered the evidence we'd gathered to be displayed on the projector screen. The falsified invoices, the cheap counterfeit materials, the black river of untreated waste, all of it, blown up on a 12-foot screen for every employee to see. The room was so silent you could hear the projector humming. Mr. Warren stood and delivered a thorough breakdown of Thornton's schemes, tracing every manipulation with forensic precision. He also revealed that Thornton himself had orchestrated the anonymous letter, a desperate attempt to remove me before I could expose him. The truth was blinding in its clarity. Every skeptical glance, every suspicious whisper that had been aimed at me evaporated in an instant, replaced by open admiration. Then my father made an announcement that brought the entire room to its feet. Based on demonstrated competence, decisive leadership, and an extraordinary contribution that saved the company from losses exceeding $500,000, he was promoting me to Vice President of Business Development, effective immediately. Kyle was promoted to Director of Quality Assurance, in recognition of his bravery and unwavering loyalty. I walked to the podium to accept the appointment in a crisp white blazer, my hair swept into a clean updo. I thanked the board for their trust, acknowledged Mr. Warren's mentorship and Kyle's courage, and expressed special gratitude to our strategic partner. My eyes found Andrew, seated in the guest section, one leg crossed casually over the other. He met my gaze with a subtle nod, and in his eyes, I saw Not just professional admiration, but something softer, something that made my pulse quicken. That evening, to celebrate, Andrew had reserved a private table at a French restaurant on the top floor of a 5-star hotel downtown. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering cityscape below. Candlelight flickered gold across white linen. A string quartet played somewhere behind a curtain of ivy. Over glasses of deep red wine, the conversation shifted away from contracts and projections for the first time. We talked about ourselves, about life. Andrew listened intently as I told him about the reckless years, the blind choices, the price I'd paid in a marriage that should never have happened. He didn't offer pity. Instead, he said something I didn't expect. He told me that a woman who could walk through fire and still keep a kind heart and a sharp mind was something rare, a diamond that most people would be lucky to even recognize. The evening stretched on warm, honest, and illuminated by an understanding that went far deeper than business. The walls of professional distance we'd carefully maintained began to dissolve, replaced by something natural and real. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt a quiet flutter in a heart I'd thought had gone permanently cold. My new office as vice president was spacious and modern, clean lines, minimalist design, floor-to-ceiling glass panels that flooded the room with natural light. I was reviewing the third-quarter market expansion plan when the desk phone rang. My secretary informed me there was an outside call patched through. The caller claimed to be family and said it was urgent. I frowned, then told her to put it through. The voice on the other end was hoarse, thick with tears, and trembling so badly the words barely held together. It took me several seconds to place it. Linda, the woman who had once stood outside my parents' house screaming curses at me for the entire neighborhood to hear. The woman who'd called me every vile name in the book. But the Linda on this phone call was a completely different creature. Gone was the belligerence, the entitlement, the venom. In its place was a voice scraped raw with desperation, addressing me with words so humble they bordered on pitiful. She called me sweetheart. She called herself Mom. She begged me to think back on the 3 years we'd lived under the same roof and find it in my heart to show her family mercy. Then she told me everything. Since Derek had been taken into custody pending trial for embezzlement and corporate fraud, their family had completely collapsed. They'd taken out a second mortgage on the house in Ohio to scrape together partial restitution for Derek's former employer. But the amount he owed was staggering. It barely made a dent. Linda herself had been hospitalized from the stress. She was stuck in a county hospital ward with no money for the bills, surviving on charity meals brought by church volunteers. And Tyler, the youngest in the family, the one who'd been coddled and spoiled his entire life, the one who used to strut around boasting about his brother's connections, was now hauling crates at a wholesale distribution warehouse, 14-hour shifts, barely enough to cover 2 meals a day from a gas station. Nowhere close to being able to care for a sick mother. Linda wept into the phone and begged me to use my business connections to pressure Derek's former company into dropping the charges. She said that if I could get them to write a letter requesting leniency, Derek might receive a reduced sentence. She swore that if Derek stayed out of prison, their whole family would work like dogs to pay back every cent they owed me. I listened to every word. I sat back in my chair, the leather creaking softly beneath me. My voice, when I finally spoke, was level and devoid of any sympathy. I refused. I reminded her of the night her son jabbed his finger in my face and threatened to take half of everything I owned. I reminded her of the day he demanded I sign over a $200,000 condo to his brother like it was a party favor. I asked her, did anyone in her family pause to consider family bonds that night? When she showed up at my parents' home, shrieking obscenities and dragging my name through the mud in front of the whole neighborhood, did she show any mercy then? I told her the law isn't a game. Derek's crimes were the product of his own insatiable greed. The entitlement and vanity that his family had nurtured in him for decades had led him straight down this road. Now they all had to live with the consequences. I had no authority to intervene in a criminal case, and even if I did, I wouldn't. I told Linda she should focus on resting and recovering. I told her to encourage Tyler to keep working honestly, that hard, unglamorous labor was the only real path forward for either of them now. Before I hung up, I said one last thing, gently but with absolute finality. Please don't call me again. Whatever existed between our families has been settled. Our accounts are closed. We walk separate roads from here." The morning of the trial was overcast. Low clouds hung heavy and grey over the city, carrying the first bite of autumn chill. I took a half day off from the office, dressed in a high-collared blouse and a structured blazer, and drove myself to the county courthouse. Today was the sentencing hearing for Derek's embezzlement and fraud case. I was present as a party with related financial claims, specifically the court-ordered recovery of the $20,000 he'd secretly funneled to his mother during our marriage. The courtroom was austere and cold. I chose a seat in the third row, kept my posture straight, my expression composed, and fixed my gaze on the defense table. When the side door opened and 2 officers escorted Derek inside, my heart gave one involuntary thud, then settled immediately. I almost didn't recognize him. The man who used to spend 45 minutes on his hair every morning, who insisted on name-brand everything, who carried himself like the world owed him a favor, that man was gone. Standing before the court was a hollowed-out shell. His hair had been shorn unevenly, close to the scalp. His cheeks were sunken. The dark circles under his eyes looked like bruises. His shoulders slumped forward, his entire frame seeming to have shrunk, as if the arrogance that once inflated him had been completely vacuumed out. When he turned his head and accidentally met my eyes, he flinched. His whole body gave a small, visible tremor. In those hollow, haunted eyes, I saw regret, the desperate, too late kind that comes only after every door has already closed. I turned away. I didn't owe him a single additional second of my attention. The proceedings moved with the cold precision of the law. The judge read the charges in a voice that left no room for ambiguity. The amounts embezzled, the forged purchase orders, the falsified signatures, the invoices that existed only on paper. Every act of deception was laid bare in meticulous, unsparing detail. No one from Derek's family was present. Linda was in the hospital. Tyler didn't have the courage to sit in a courtroom and watch his brother's disgrace. Derek stood alone, head bowed, and entered his guilty plea. When the judge delivered the sentence, the courtroom fell into absolute silence. 7 years in prison. Additionally, the court ordered full restitution of my $20,000 to be recovered through the seizure and liquidation of Derek's remaining personal assets. The sound of the gavel striking the bench echoed through the room like a period at the end of a very long, very ugly sentence. Derek's knees buckled. He crumpled to the floor, buried his face in his hands, and wept deep, shuddering sobs that shook his entire body. I stood up. I smoothed the front of my blazer. I walked out of the courtroom before the officers led him away. When I stepped through the courthouse doors, the clouds had thinned. Pale shafts of midday sun were breaking through the gray, casting long, clean lines of light across the courthouse steps. I filled my lungs with cool, sharp air and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Lightness. Every burden, every injustice, every shadow from the past, it all felt like it had been scrubbed clean and carried away. From this moment forward, my life was entirely my own. No more chains to anyone unworthy of my time, my energy, or my heart. November brought its particular kind of chill to the city, but on the island Key West the air was balmy and golden with subtropical warmth. I wasn't there for vacation. I was attending a national business leadership summit as an official representative of our company, and the person who had sent me a personal invitation was none other than Andrew. My flight landed in the early afternoon. Andrew had arranged a private car to meet me at the airport and drive me straight to a 5-star beachfront resort, the kind of place where the sound of waves replaced the need for background music. He was waiting in the lobby when I walked in. He wore a light blue linen shirt, white slacks, leather sandals, looking nothing like the boardroom titan I was used to. Relaxed, almost boyish, but still unmistakably commanding. He stepped forward, took my suitcase from me without asking, and asked with genuine concern whether the long flight had worn me out. The effortless care in every small gesture stirred something warm in my chest, something I was becoming less and less willing to ignore. The first evening's welcome gala was held outdoors beside the resort's grand infinity pool. CEOs, founders, and managing directors from across the country mingled in their finest evening wear beneath strings of amber lights and swaying palms. I chose a wine-red cocktail dress, elegant, understated, perfectly fitted. My hair fell in loose curls over my shoulders. The moment I appeared at the edge of the terrace, Andrew's gaze found me and stayed. The admiration in his eyes wasn't something he tried to hide. He offered his arm and walked me through the crowd, introducing me personally to the senior investors and executives in his network. With his guidance, I slipped naturally into conversations about macro-level supply chain strategy, international trade corridors, and emerging market opportunities. My confidence, my insights, and my willingness to listen earned immediate respect from people who'd been in the game for decades. New partnerships began forming real ones, with real potential for our company. Throughout the evening, Andrew was never far. He pulled out my chair before I could reach for it. He noticed when I'd been nursing the same glass of wine too long and quietly replaced it with a fresh pressed juice, worried I'd overdo it. Every gesture was small. Every gesture mattered. When the crowd began thinning and guests drifted toward their rooms, Andrew caught my eye and tilted his head toward the beach. "A walk," he suggested. "Just the two of us." The Key West night was impossibly still. There was nothing but the rhythmic hush of waves lapping against white sand and a sky so vast and clear it looked like someone had scattered crushed diamonds across black velvet. We slipped off our shoes and walked barefoot at the water's edge, cool saltwater threading between our toes. The pressures of the business world, the deals, the strategies, the constant calculations seemed to evaporate completely. Andrew told me about his childhood dreams, about why he'd chosen to come back to the States and build something of his own instead of taking over his family's overseas operations. I told him about my plans for the company's future, the markets I wanted to break into, the legacy I wanted to build. There were no agendas, no posturing, just two people discovering, wave by wave, that they spoke the same language in ways that had nothing to do with business. When a gust of ocean breeze swept past and I shivered involuntarily, Andrew slipped off his jacket and draped it gently over my shoulders. The warmth of the fabric, still carrying his scent, cedar and sea salt, and something indefinably him, and the way he looked at me under that canopy of stars. I knew. My heart, which I'd kept locked behind reinforced steel ever since the divorce, had finally decided to open its doors again. The summit was going better than I could have hoped. Major contracts were being finalized after tense negotiations. I felt more energized and optimistic about the company's trajectory than I had in years. Then, on the morning of the third day, the calm shattered. I was having breakfast on the Ocean View terrace, watching the turquoise water catch the early light, when Andrew appeared, and immediately I knew something was wrong. The ease was gone from his face. His jaw was set. He sat down across from me and explained the situation. His investment fund was under attack. Competitors who couldn't beat him fairly had launched a coordinated smear campaign, spreading false rumors about the fund's financial transparency, even agitating a faction of shareholders to pressure the board. Through a rapid internal investigation, Andrew had traced the source. The person pulling the strings was Derek's former boss, a man who had long harbored a personal grudge against Andrew over past business dealings. With Derek's arrest and the collapse of his old company, this man had seized the opportunity to pin blame on Andrew, claiming he'd engineered the whole downfall as revenge. It was a lie, but a dangerous one. Andrew had to fly back to the city immediately to contain the crisis, stabilize shareholder confidence, and kill the rumors before they metastasized. He apologized for the abruptness, but as the fund's managing director, he simply could not be absent when the house was under siege. I looked into his eyes and saw more than professional anxiety. I saw the reluctance of a man who didn't want to leave the woman sitting across from him, not now, not when everything between them was finally becoming real. I told him what he already knew. Work comes first. I understood his responsibilities completely. I assured him I would stay in Key West, fulfill our company's obligations at the remaining events, attend the closing ceremonies, and nurture every relationship he'd helped me build. There was a part of me that felt the absence before he even left, but I also knew I was more than capable of handling this on my own. Before he got into the car to the airport, Andrew took my hand. He told me to take care of myself. He walked me through potential tricky questions that other attendees might ask in his absence, and he promised the moment the storm back home was settled, he would fly straight back. I watched his car disappear down the palm-lined driveway and felt the quiet weight of being on my own again. But this time, instead of fear, I felt resolve. I would work twice as hard, not just to prove my own capabilities, but to show Andrew that his trust in me was the best investment he'd ever made. With Andrew gone, the summit's spotlight shifted squarely onto me. Several attendees began asking pointed questions about his sudden departure. A few competitors probed with barely concealed suspicion, but I maintained my composure, calm, gracious, unflappable. I understood that this was the real test, not the Georgia plant raid, not the anonymous letter. This, standing alone on a stage full of sharks, was where my mettle would be proven. That afternoon, the organizers held an open forum, Women in Business, Leading Through Reinvention. To my surprise, I was invited to speak. I walked onto the stage in an ivory dress, no notes, no teleprompter. Under the spotlight, I told my story, all of it. I spoke about the failed marriage, about being betrayed, about how greed and entitlement from the people closest to me had nearly broken me, but I didn't dwell on the pain. I pivoted to the rebuilding, how I reclaimed my financial independence through the legal system, how I refused the easy path of nepotism and started from the bottom, how I learned that the hardest battles are the ones you fight against, your own willingness to settle. I told the room that women are never anyone's accessory, and that after devastation, instead of searching for a lifeboat, we must learn to become the ship itself, strong enough to cross any ocean. The applause was thunderous. It rolled through the ballroom in waves that didn't stop for what felt like minutes. Afterward, executives from major companies sought me out personally. Several investors told me they'd underestimated me and that they wouldn't make that mistake again. They saw in me not just a businesswoman, but a leader with both heart and steel. My career had officially reached a new altitude. That evening, standing in front of the mirror in my hotel suite, I barely recognized the woman staring back. Radiant, confident, at peace. Self-reliance, I thought, is the most brilliant diamond a woman can ever cut for herself. I knew Andrew would be proud, and I couldn't wait to share this victory with him. True to his word, Andrew flew back to Key West that very night. He landed just in time for the closing gala. I was standing alone on the restaurant's open-air balcony, gazing at the vast dark ocean, when a familiar warm hand settled gently on my shoulder. He looked tired. There were faint lines under his eyes that hadn't been there before. But Oshrinko, right the moment he saw me, something in his face lifted like the sun breaking through after days of cloud cover. He told me everything had been handled. The rumors were debunked. The shareholders were reassured. If anything, the fund's reputation had come out stronger than before. The gala was magical strings of lights in the palm trees, soft music drifting through the salt air, the low murmur of conversation and laughter. But Andrew didn't lead me inside. He took my hand and guided me away from the crowd, down a sandy path to a private stretch of beach where the only sound was the sea. Under a sky bursting with stars, in the kind of silence that makes the world feel infinite, Andrew stopped walking. He turned to face me. The look in his eyes, unguarded, vulnerable, certain, all at once made my breath catch. He told me everything he'd been holding back. He said he'd been drawn to me from the very first meeting, the way I'd stood my ground in that conference room and defended my proposal without flinching. He told me he'd watched me rebuild my entire life with an iron will that left him in awe. He said that for him, wealth and success had always been tools, means to an end. But the most valuable thing he'd ever found wasn't a deal or an acquisition. It was understanding. And he'd found it in me. Then he asked, his voice low and steady, would I give him the chance to stand beside me, to protect me, to walk with me, to help me write the next chapter. I stood there on that quiet beach, the ocean whispering at my feet and 1,000 stars overhead, and felt something I hadn't felt in years, safety. Not the kind that comes from money or power, but the kind that comes from being truly seen. No demands, no manipulation, no hidden agenda, just respect and a love offered freely, without conditions. My eyes burned. I managed to nod, small but sure. Andrew's face broke into the most radiant smile I'd ever seen on him. He stepped closer, took my hand in both of his, and pressed his lips gently against my knuckles, a quiet seal on a brand new beginning. We sat down on the sand together and talked about the future. A life built on equality and shared purpose. A home where love meant lifting each other up, not tearing each other down. In that moment, I knew every storm I'd weathered had led me here, and this time, the harbor was real. 3 months had passed since the divorce. All legal proceedings, the asset division, the court-ordered restitution of the $20,000 were finalized. I had moved into a beautiful townhouse in one of the city's best neighborhoods, and my life had settled into a rhythm that felt, for the first time, truly mine. My career was soaring. Under my leadership, and with Mr. Warren's steady guidance, the company had weathered its darkest chapter and emerged as a leading import-export firm in the region. New projects were launching quarter after quarter, generating strong revenue and creating hundreds of jobs. Meanwhile, Derek's world had continued its freefall. He was out on bail, awaiting the date he'd report to begin serving his 7-year sentence. His life was a wasteland. Debts piling on debts. His former colleagues had disowned him. Old friends wouldn't return his calls. Even the house in Ohio was on the verge of foreclosure. And in that pit of desperation, staring at the walls of the cramped motel room he could barely afford, Derek's mind drifted to me, to my townhouse, to the life I'd built, to the money I had. He convinced himself in the delusional way only a desperate man can that maybe I still had feelings for him, that I'd take pity on him, that I would be his last lifeline before prison swallowed him whole. He showed up at my neighborhood that morning, slipped past the front gate behind a delivery truck. His clothes hung loose on a frame that had shed 30 pounds of ego and arrogance. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken. He rang my doorbell over and over, rehearsing in his head the scene he'd imagined me dissolving into tears at the sight of him, overcome by old affection, pulling him inside. The door opened, and Derek went absolutely rigid. The woman standing in the doorway was not the mousy, apologetic wife he remembered. I was wearing a silk loungewear set, my hair falling naturally past my shoulders, my skin glowing. The confidence, the poise, the quiet authority of a vice president who commanded boardrooms, it radiated off me like heat from sunlit stone. But what destroyed him, what drove the final nail straight through whatever delusion he'd carried here, was the man standing just behind me. Andrew was there, one hand resting lightly on the small of my back, relaxed, proprietary, the gesture of a man who belonged exactly where he was. Derek looked at Andrew at the tailored clothes, the quiet confidence, the unmistakable aura of someone who had built real wealth through real work and understood in one annihilating instant just how vast the chasm between them was. He saw the happiness on my face, genuine happiness, the kind he had never once given me. He realized he had thrown away a diamond because he was too blind and too greedy to know what he was holding. Without a word, no apology, no plea, no rehearsed speech, Derek pressed his hands against his face, turned, and ran. He ran like a man being chased by his own reflection, out of the neighborhood, down the street, toward the life that was waiting for him, a cell, a number, 7 years of silence to sit with the choices he'd made. The story closed the way stories should, with everything returned to its proper place. Derek entered prison to begin his 7-year sentence. 7 years to pay for the betrayal, the theft, and the staggering arrogance that had defined his every decision. Tyler, stripped of every illusion about easy money and borrowed status, resigned himself to 14-hour shifts at the wholesale warehouse. He hauled crates from dawn to dark, earning just enough each day to keep himself fed and cover his mother's most basic medical bills. Linda retreated to a small rental back in Ohio, where she lived out her remaining years in quiet solitude, a woman finally confronting the consequences of raising sons to believe the world owed them everything. As for me, the business flourished. The company, under my watch and with Mr. Warren's mentorship, expanded into new markets and became one of the top import-export operations in the region. Every new project created jobs. Every new contract strengthened the legacy my father had built and that I was now carrying forward. But success wasn't the whole story. One evening, a quiet Friday, Andrew and I sat across from each other at our dining table. No shouting, no manipulation, no one calculating how to extract something from the other. Just a home-cooked meal, a bottle of wine, and two people who had chosen each other not out of need, but out of genuine respect and love. We talked about our newest venture, a startup fund for women entrepreneurs, a foundation designed to give women who'd survived difficult circumstances the capital and the mentorship to build something of their own. It was Andrew's idea, but I was the one driving it forward. It felt like the most meaningful work I'd ever done. Andrew reached across the table and took my hand. His eyes, still as steady, still as warm as the first night on that beach in Key West, held mine without a word needing to be said. I turned to look out the window at the city skyline, alive with 10,000 points of light. Life is a long road with more forks and detours than anyone can predict. I had stumbled, I had fallen, I had been betrayed by someone who swore to love me and exploited by people who called themselves family. But every single one of those wounds had forged me into the woman sitting here tonight. Happiness isn't a destination. It's the journey you walk and the people worthy enough to walk it with you. The most important lesson I ever learned was this: believe in your own worth. Live with integrity. Fight for what's right, even when it's terrifying. And never, ever let someone else's greed convince you that you deserve less. The future stretched out before me like a canvas, vivid, luminous, and full. I knew I would always be the captain of my own ship, steering toward harbors of my own choosing. A future I had earned, a future I deserved. If there's one thing this story leaves us with, it's this: a woman's value is never measured by how much she endures in silence. It's measured by the moment she stands up, dusts herself off, and decides with calm, unshakable clarity that she will never settle for less than she's worth. Love without respect is not love. It's a transaction, and a bad one. The law of cause and effect doesn't take vacations. Those who build their happiness on lies and theft will watch it all collapse, often sooner than they expect. And sometimes, losing someone who never valued you isn't a loss at all. It's the door swinging open to everything you were always meant to have. Don't be afraid to fight for yourself, because only when you have the courage to walk away from what's broken can you make room for what's beautiful. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. I hope it leaves you a little stronger, a little braver, and a little more certain that when you live with honesty and fight with everything you've got, the happiness you deserve will find you in its own time, in its own way, exactly when you're ready.